Selma Davis had just finished a long day at her law firm in Montgomery when her mother's voice cracked through the phone like a shattered mirror. "Your grandfather? He's gone, Selma. They found him hanged." The words didn't register at first. Judge Davis, the man who raised her with stories of resilience, was dead. And worse, the police called it suicide. By the time she arrived in her hometown of Ashford, Alabama, a dark cloud hung over the small community. A few reporters lingered outside the police station, but no real investigation seemed to be underway. As she walked toward the crime scene, her stomach twisted. There, beneath an ancient oak tree, was the rope, cut down but still swaying in the wind. Something wasn't right. Judge Davis had been a fighter all his life. Selma knew her grandfather would never take his own life. Sheriff Tompkins barely looked up when she entered the station. "It's a tragedy, Ms. Davis," he said, his southern drawl thick and slow. "But sometimes old folks just give up." His indifference sent a rage through Selma that she barely contained. "That's not what happened," she countered, placing a file on his desk. His bank account had unusual withdrawals. He had no history of depression. And why was he found hanging from a tree? "In this town? You're telling me that's just a coincidence?" Tompkins sighed, scratching at his graying beard. "I know it looks bad, but there's no evidence of foul play." Selma clenched her fists. That was the problem. If her grandfather had been murdered, someone had made sure there wouldn't be any evidence. And that meant the killer had power. Ashford, Alabama, was a town built on contradictions. The oak trees lining Main Street stood as silent witnesses to history, some of it noble, much of it dark. Selma had spent her childhood here, running through the cotton fields behind her grandfather's house, listening to his stories about resilience, struggle, and the silent war against injustice that had never truly ended. Judge Nathaniel Davis had been a living monument to that fight. A civil rights lawyer before donning the judge's robe, he had spent decades exposing corruption, overturning wrongful convictions, and forcing Ashford to reckon with its past. Many in town respected him, but just as many despised him. Now he was dead, and Selma was certain it wasn't by his own hand. She stood in his study, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco still lingering in the air. Her fingers traced the spines of legal texts, some older than she was. On his desk sat a stack of letters, unopened. A shiver ran down her spine as she flipped through them. The first few were utility bills, mundane and expected. But then she saw the others. No return address. No signature. Just 3 words, scrawled in black ink, "Stay in line." Her heart pounded. These weren't warnings. They were threats. And her grandfather had kept them, quietly enduring something he hadn't shared with her. A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. It was her childhood friend, Marcus Reed, now a local reporter. His expression was grave. "Selma, you're not going to like this," he said, handing her a folder of old newspaper clippings. She skimmed them quickly. Lynchings, disappearances, cases from decades ago, all dismissed as suicides or accidents. But the victims had one thing in common. They had all challenged the town's most powerful families. Her grandfather was just the latest. And if she wasn't careful, she could be next. Selma sat at her grandfather's desk, her fingers tightening around the newspaper clippings Marcus had handed her. The stories spanned decades. Black men and women found dead under suspicious circumstances, always written off as suicides, accidents, or crimes without suspects. Some were activists, others business owners, teachers, preachers, people who had dared to challenge something unseen, something bigger than them. She exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling deep in her chest. "This isn't a coincidence," she said, her voice steady but low. Marcus leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed. "I've been digging into these cases for years. No one ever talks about it, but there's a pattern. Your grandfather knew it. I think he was getting too close to something." Selma's jaw clenched. And now he's dead. The air between them grew thick. She stared at the last article in the stack, one from 1972, a small blurb about a man named Harold Jeffries. Found hanging in his barn. Suicide, they said. But the margins of the paper were scribbled with her grandfather's notes. Not a suicide. He knew too much. The order is real. Selma ran a finger over the faded ink. The order. Marcus hesitated. It's just a rumor. A secret group? Old money, old power. People say they've been controlling Ashford from the shadows for generations. White supremacists with influence in politics, law enforcement, even the courts. Selma's stomach twisted. You think they killed my grandfather? Marcus's eyes darkened. I think he was about to expose them. And if that's the case, we need to be careful, Selma. These people, they don't just kill. They erase. A sudden chill ran through her. The order. It sounded like something out of a conspiracy theory. But the fear in Marcus's voice was real. And if what he was saying was true, then Judge Nathaniel Davis wasn't just murdered. He was silenced. And whoever did it wasn't finished yet. Selma barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of her grandfather hanging from that tree. His strong hands, which once held hers so tightly, now lifeless. His face, once so full of wisdom and strength, contorted in a grotesque final moment. But the worst part was knowing, deep in her gut, that this wasn't over. By morning, she was determined. She had spent years studying law to fight injustices like this. If the police wouldn't investigate, she would. She was poring over her grandfather's notes at the kitchen table when her mother's voice called out from the porch. Selma. She rushed outside to find her mother standing stiffly, holding an envelope. No stamp, no return address, just her name in red ink. Selma's hands shook as she tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of her grandfather's house, taken last night. She swallowed hard, flipping it over. More of that same sharp handwriting. Walk away, or you'll end up just like him. Her skin prickled. Someone had been watching her. Someone knew she was digging. Marcus showed up minutes later, his face tense as she handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly, muttering a curse under his breath. This is a message. They know you're not letting this go. Selma's hands tightened into fists. Then they should know I'm not afraid. Marcus gave her a hard look. You should be. A car rolled slowly down the street, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Selma and Marcus both turned. The car didn't stop, didn't speed up, just moved past them, slow and deliberate. A warning. But Selma wasn't backing down. If the order thought they could scare her off, they were about to learn. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. And she was just getting started. Selma sat in her grandfather's study, staring at the leather-bound journal she had found buried beneath a stack of legal files. The worn cover bore his initials, Indy, and as she opened it, the scent of aged paper filled the room. The first pages were filled with notes on old cases, but as she flipped further, the handwriting became more frantic. Names, dates, places, and one phrase repeated over and over. They're still here. Her breath hitched. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his expression grim. This is proof, he murmured. Your grandfather knew who was behind this. She ran her fingers over the ink, searching for a connection. Some names were familiar. Local politicians, business owners, even law enforcement. Others she didn't recognize. But then, near the back, a list stopped her cold. Deaths ruled as suicides. Her grandfather had written down each one. Harold Jeffries, 1972. Luther Banks, 1985. Dion Carter, 1996. The list stretched on, leading up to one final entry. Nathaniel Davis, 2025. Her grandfather had predicted his own death. A cold chill ran down her spine. Marcus exhaled sharply. Selma, this isn't just a racist secret society. This is a damn kill list. Her mind raced. The order wasn't just covering up old crimes. They were still active, and her grandfather had gotten too close. She slammed the journal shut. We need more. Marcus hesitated. And what if we find it? Selma met his gaze. Then we burn the order to the ground. Outside, the street was eerily quiet. Too quiet. And that's when she saw it. A single white envelope on the doorstep. They were watching. Again, Selma's breath caught as she stared at the envelope resting on the doorstep. The morning air was still, too heavy, too silent. Marcus stood behind her, his muscles tense. Don't touch it, he muttered. Ignoring him, Selma crouched down, her fingers trembling as she picked up the envelope. The paper was smooth, expensive. Whoever had left it wasn't just trying to scare her. They wanted her to know they had power. She tore it open, her pulse pounding in her ears. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were written in red ink. "You were warned." Her stomach clenched, but as she unfolded the paper further, her body went cold. Attached was a photograph, a picture of her grandfather, taken before his death. He was standing outside a courthouse, his expression serious, but something was off. Behind him, in the shadows, was a figure, a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured. Marcus snatched the paper from her hand. "This was taken recently," he said, his voice tight. "Someone was following him." Selma gritted her teeth. "And now they're following me." A rustling noise from the street made them both snap to attention. A black sedan was parked just up the road, its engine running. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but Selma could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her. Marcus grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." Selma didn't argue. She clutched the letter tightly as they hurried inside, locking the door behind them. Her mind was racing. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. The order wasn't done with her. And if she wasn't careful, she'd end up just like her grandfather. Selma barely had time to process what she had just read before a knock at the door made her and Marcus freeze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was deliberate. Marcus shot her a look and reached for the pistol he kept tucked at his waist. Selma moved carefully to the window, peeking through the blinds. A man stood on the porch. Middle-aged, sharp suit, clean-shaven. He looked like he belonged in a courtroom, not standing outside her grandfather's house at dusk. "Who is it?" Marcus whispered. Selma shook her head. "I don't know." The man knocked again. This time he spoke. "Ms. Davis, I'd like to have a word." His voice was calm, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. Selma hesitated. Marcus moved closer. "You don't have to open it." But Selma knew she had to. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here to make small talk. She unlatched the door, but didn't step aside. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You've been asking questions about your grandfather. That's a dangerous thing to do." Selma's stomach tightened, but she refused to look away. "Is that a threat?" The man tilted his head. "It's a warning. You're standing on the wrong side of history, Ms. Davis. Some doors should remain closed." Selma clenched her jaw. "And if I don't stop?" The man's smile widened, but there was nothing friendly about it. He reached into his coat. Marcus tensed, ready to pull his gun, but the man only pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Selma. "Your grandfather made the same mistake." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Selma unfolded the paper. A single address was written on it. The Ashford estate. Marcus exhaled. "Looks like we just got our next lead." Selma's pulse quickened. The order was playing games. But if they thought she would back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Selma gripped the paper tightly as she and Marcus sat in his car outside the Ashford estate. The towering iron gates were shut, adorned with the family crest, a coiled serpent wrapped around a sword. The mansion itself loomed in the distance, its stone facade lit by soft, golden lights. "Biggest plantation in the state, back in the day," Marcus murmured. "Now it's home to one of the richest families in Alabama." Selma's eyes narrowed. "And one of the most dangerous." Marcus tapped the wheel. "You sure about this? They practically invited us." Selma exhaled. "That man at my door wasn't just giving a warning. He wanted us to come here." Marcus sighed. "Then it's a trap." Selma smirked. "Probably." Marcus shook his head. "You got a death wish?" She opened the car door. "No, I've got unfinished business." Together, they approached the gate. A camera above the entrance whirred to life, adjusting its lens. Selma looked straight into it. Moments later, the gates creaked open. "Yeah," Marcus muttered, "this ain't suspicious at all." The driveway stretched long, lined with old oak trees draped in Spanish moss. As they walked, Selma's heart pounded. Somewhere on this land, her grandfather had found something that had cost him his life. By the time they reached the massive front doors, they were already open. A butler in a pressed suit stood waiting, expression unreadable. Mr. Calloway is expecting you, he said. Selma's blood ran cold. Warren Calloway, the man her grandfather had written about. The man who, if he was truly behind the order, had ordered her grandfather's death. She squared her shoulders. Time to meet the devil himself. Selma stepped into the grand foyer of the Ashford estate, the scent of polished wood and aged bourbon lingering in the air. A chandelier hung above, its golden glow casting eerie shadows across the marble floors. Marcus walked beside her, his muscles tense, eyes scanning every corner. A slow clap echoed through the hall. Ms. Davis. The voice was smooth, deep, and filled with amusement. Selma turned to see Warren Calloway descending the grand staircase. He was older than she expected, mid-60s perhaps, but his posture was straight, his presence commanding. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his suit impeccable. "I must say, you are your grandfather's granddaughter," he said, reaching the final step. "Curious, stubborn, and entirely too bold for your own good." Selma didn't flinch. "Funny, I was about to say the same about you, minus the good part." Calloway chuckled, unfazed. "Ah, the fire of youth." He gestured toward the sitting room. "Please join me. We have much to discuss." Selma exchanged a glance with Marcus. He shook his head slightly, but she ignored him. She stepped forward, forcing Calloway to meet her gaze. "You killed my grandfather." Calloway sighed, as if disappointed. "Is that what you believe?" Selma clenched her fists. "I don't believe. I know." Calloway walked to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a drink. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man, strong-willed, determined, but he didn't know when to stop." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "And you, Ms. Davis, do you know when to stop?" Selma's stomach twisted, but she held her ground. "Not until I get the truth." Calloway smirked. "Then I suppose you should sit. Because the truth, dear girl, is far worse than you think." Selma stayed standing. Calloway took a slow sip of his drink, then looked her dead in the eyes. "Your grandfather didn't just uncover a secret. He was part of it." Selma felt the words settle in the room like smoke. Thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. He was part of it. Her grandfather? The same man who spent his life fighting injustice? The thought was impossible. "You're lying," she said, her voice tight. Calloway chuckled, swirling his drink. "Am I?" Selma's hands curled into fists. "My grandfather would never be part of something as vile as the order." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't he?" He took another sip, watching her over the rim of his glass. "What do you really know about the man you're fighting for?" Selma opened her mouth, but Marcus beat her to it. "Enough to know he'd rather die than work with scum like you." Calloway sighed and set his glass down. "Your grandfather was many things, Ms. Davis. But above all else, he was a survivor." He walked to the fireplace, gazing at the flames as if reminiscing. "Years ago, before you were even born, he came to understand something crucial. Fighting the order from the outside was a death sentence. So, he did the only thing a smart man could do." Selma's breath caught in her throat. "He joined." "No," she whispered. "Yes," Calloway said, turning to face her fully. "He swore the oath, sat at the table, listened, learned, and waited." Selma shook her head. "If that's true, then why did you kill him?" Calloway smirked. "Because he forgot the first rule of survival, Ms. Davis." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He started asking questions. Selma's stomach churned. Her grandfather had infiltrated the order, not to be part of it, but to destroy it. And for that, they made sure he died a traitor's death. Calloway studied her expression, then sighed, as if bored. "It's a shame, really. He was a man of conviction. But you..." His lips curled into a smile. "You're young. You still have a choice." Selma's pulse quickened. "A choice?" Calloway leaned in slightly. "Walk away, Ms. Davis. Go back to your law office. Build a future. Live." He tilted his head. "Or keep digging and end up just like him." Silence stretched between them. Then Selma smiled. "See, that's where you're wrong, Mr. Calloway." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I don't have a choice." She let the words hang, watching the amusement flicker from his face. I have a promise. Calloway's smirk returned, but this time it was different. Darker. Then I suppose we'll see if you're as strong as your grandfather was. Selma turned on her heel and walked out. Marcus followed, his grip tight on his concealed weapon. The moment they stepped outside, Marcus let out a low breath. That went well. Selma barely heard him. Her mind was already racing. Her grandfather had spent years gathering secrets from within the order. Somewhere, he had left behind the proof she needed to burn them to the ground. She just had to find it before they found her. The night air outside the Ashford estate was thick with humidity, but Selma barely noticed. Her mind spun with Calloway's words. Her grandfather had been part of the order, not as one of them, but as a spy. That meant he had left something behind. Evidence, documents, something that could expose the truth. She and Marcus walked swiftly to the car, both on edge. We need to find out what your granddad was working on before they killed him, Marcus said, gripping the steering wheel. He must have left a trail. Selma exhaled. If he did, it's somewhere they haven't found yet. Marcus started the engine. Then we start where he spent most of his time. They drove in tense silence until they reached Selma's childhood home, her grandfather's house. The small, one-story home sat on the outskirts of Montgomery, untouched since his death. Selma hesitated before unlocking the door. Inside, everything was as he had left it. His old leather chair faced the TV. Framed photos lined the mantel. One of Selma at her law school graduation, another of her grandfather shaking hands with a civil rights leader. Selma moved past the familiar warmth of the living room and went straight to his study. The room smelled of old books and pipe smoke. His desk sat neatly organized, but she knew better. Her grandfather had always been careful. His secrets wouldn't be in plain sight. She ran her fingers along the wooden desk, then paused. Marcus! He looked up from scanning the bookshelves. Selma bent down, running her hands underneath the desk surface. Her fingers grazed something metal, a latch, a hidden compartment. Heart pounding, she flipped the latch. A section of the desk popped open, revealing a thin, leather-bound journal. She carefully pulled it out and opened it. The first few pages were filled with names, dates, locations, and a symbol she had seen before. The coiled serpent wrapped around a sword, the emblem of the order. Marcus leaned over her shoulder. Shit! Selma flipped through, stopping at an entry dated 2 weeks before her grandfather's death. I have proof. They will kill me for it. But the truth must come out. The next line made her blood run cold. Selma, if you're reading this, trust no one. Not even the law. A sharp noise came from outside. Selma's head snapped up. Headlights. A car had pulled up in front of the house. They weren't alone. The glow of headlights flooded through the curtains, stretching shadows across the wooden floor. Selma's breath hitched. Someone had followed them. Marcus moved fast, peering through a crack in the blinds. Black SUV. No plates. Selma's stomach twisted. The order. Marcus nodded grimly. Looks like they aren't wasting time. A car door creaked open outside. Then another. Selma clutched the journal tightly. We need to get out of here. Now. Marcus pulled his gun from his waistband and gestured for her to move. Back door. Stay low. They moved quickly through the kitchen, the weight of her grandfather's words pressing on her. Trust no one. Not even the law. Before they could reach the back door, heavy knocks rattled the front of the house. Ms. Davis, a voice called out deep and calm. We just want to talk. Selma froze. The voice was familiar. Detective Alan Grayson. She had spoken to him the night they ruled her grandfather's death a suicide. He was a veteran cop, respected in the community. Could she trust him? Marcus didn't hesitate. He shook his head sharply. No way. If he's working with them, we're dead. Selma's hands tightened around the journal. Her grandfather had warned her. Not even the law. Ms. Davis, Grayson's voice came again. You don't want to make this difficult. A second voice, colder, unfamiliar, muttered something, and suddenly the front door handle twisted. They had no intention of talking. Marcus cursed under his breath. Back window. They bolted toward the small laundry room. Marcus unlocked the window and helped Selma climb through first. She hit the ground in a crouch just as she heard the front door burst open. Clear the rooms, Grayson ordered from inside. Selma's heart pounded. They were searching for her. Marcus landed beside her, and they sprinted through the backyard, keeping low. The SUV's engine was still running, its driver waiting. They slipped through the gate and into the neighbor's yard, using the darkness as cover. Behind them, the voices inside grew louder. "She's not here," one of them said. Grayson's voice followed, tight with frustration. "Then find her." Selma and Marcus didn't stop running. Her grandfather's warning had been right. Nowhere was safe. Selma's breath burned in her chest as she and Marcus cut through backyards and dark alleyways, putting as much distance as possible between them and her grandfather's house. Montgomery's humid night air clung to her skin, but she barely noticed. The order had people inside the police force. Her mind raced. Detective Grayson was one of them. That meant they had influence, resources, and the power to erase any trace of her grandfather's truth. Marcus pulled her into the shadows behind an abandoned gas station, his gun still in hand. They crouched low, listening. No sirens, no shouting. But that didn't mean they weren't being hunted. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow. "We need a car. They'll be watching the roads." Selma clutched the journal to her chest. "We can't just disappear. We have to use this." Marcus gave her a hard look. "Selma, they knew exactly where to find us. That means someone's watching you. Your phone, your bank cards, maybe even people close to you. We can't go back to your place. We can't go to anyone you know." Selma swallowed hard. Her world had just shrunk to nothing. No safe house, no police protection, no allies, except Marcus. He checked his phone and cursed. "I can't even call my guy for a burner phone. We need cash." Selma's mind flickered to a possibility. A place where they wouldn't be expected. "My Aunt Thelma." Marcus frowned. "She's still in Selma, right?" Selma nodded. "She runs a little soul food joint off the highway. Cash only. No cameras. She and my grandfather weren't close, but she always respected him." Marcus considered it. "That's over an hour away. We'll have to steal a car." Selma hesitated but nodded. She had never broken the law in her life, but the order had declared war on her. Playing by the rules wasn't an option anymore. Marcus peeked around the corner. A rundown pickup sat outside a boarded-up pawn shop. Old, easy to hotwire. He turned to her. "You ready for this?" Selma looked at the journal in her hands. She had no choice. "Yeah," she whispered. "Let's go." Marcus moved quickly, keeping his steps light as he approached the rusted pickup. Selma stood close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never stolen so much as a pen in her life, and now she was about to commit grand theft auto. Marcus tested the door handle, unlocked. "Lucky us," he muttered. He slid into the driver's seat, and Selma followed, glancing nervously at the empty street. The city was quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Marcus reached under the dashboard, his fingers working quickly. Within seconds, the old truck's engine sputtered to life. Selma exhaled, both relieved and terrified. "Where'd you learn to hotwire cars?" Marcus smirked, shifting the truck into gear. "You asked too many questions." They pulled onto the empty road, heading west towards Selma, Alabama. Streetlights flashed past, casting eerie shadows inside the cab. Selma clutched her grandfather's journal, flipping through pages filled with coded notes, dates, and locations. Then, her eyes caught something, a name. Grayson. She stiffened. "Marcus." He glanced at her. "What?" She turned the journal toward him. Beside the name was a date, 1998, and a note in her grandfather's shaky handwriting. "Initiated. Dangerous. No moral compass." Selma's stomach twisted. Her grandfather had known about Grayson for decades. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel. That means he's not just a cop in their pocket. He's been one of them for years. Selma's blood ran cold. Which means he isn't just trying to scare us. He's trying to kill us. The realization hit hard. Grayson wasn't some pawn. He was a predator. Marcus stepped on the gas. "We need to get to your aunts before they figure out where we're going." Selma stared out the window, gripping the journal as if it could protect her. Grayson was hunting them. And if the order had been killing for generations, he wasn't the only one. They were running out of time. The truck roared down the dark highway, its old engine rattling as Marcus pushed it past safe limits. Selma kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for headlights, for any sign of pursuit. Her hands trembled as she gripped the journal in her lap. "Marcus, how we even know Aunt Thelma is safe?" she asked. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight. "We don't, but she's off the grid enough that the order might not think to check there right away. We just need to lay low and figure out our next move." Selma wasn't convinced, but they had no better option. The road stretched endlessly ahead, only the occasional flicker of a distant truck stop breaking the emptiness. It felt too quiet, too easy. Then Marcus stiffened. "We've got company." Selma twisted around, her stomach dropping. A pair of headlights had appeared behind them, moving too fast, gaining on them. Marcus swore under his breath. "That's not a random car." Selma's breath came shallow. "How did they find us?" Marcus pressed down on the gas, but the old truck struggled to keep up. The pursuing vehicle, a sleek black sedan, grew closer, its high beams flooding their truck with blinding light. Then came the first gunshot. Selma screamed as the back windshield shattered, glass spraying into the cab. Marcus swerved hard, barely keeping control. "They're trying to run us off the road," he shouted. The sedan pulled up alongside them. Selma caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in a black mask, eyes cold and calculating. The passenger leaned out with a pistol. Another shot rang out, tearing through the truck's side mirror. "Hold on," Marcus yelled. He jerked the wheel, ramming the truck into the sedan's side. Metal crunched, tires screeched. The sedan swerved but quickly corrected, relentless. Selma's pulse pounded in her ears. "We can't outrun them." Marcus gritted his teeth. "We don't have to." Ahead, the road curved sharply around a wooded drop-off. Without hesitation, Marcus yanked the wheel, sending the truck veering off the pavement, straight into the trees. The world spun as the truck crashed through branches, tires bouncing over uneven ground. Selma's scream was lost in the chaos. Then impact. The truck slammed to a stop, the front end crushed against a massive oak. Selma's body lurched forward, her seatbelt biting into her ribs. Everything went silent except for the ringing in her ears. Marcus groaned beside her. "You alive?" Selma blinked, dazed. "Yeah, you." Selma hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. The gunshot still echoed in her ears as she scrambled to her feet. Marcus landed beside her, already moving. "Go," he hissed, shoving her forward. Another shot rang out, splintering the wood of the cabin behind them. Selma didn't look back. She ran, her heart pounding, her legs burning as they tore through the trees. Branches slapped against her skin, but she barely felt them. Grayson's men were closing in. Their shouts grew louder. The flashlights bobbing behind them cast eerie shadows, illuminating the hunt. Marcus grabbed Selma's wrist, pulling her in a different direction. "We split up at the river," he said. "They can't chase both of us." Selma's chest tightened. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Marcus shot back. "Take the journal. Get to Montgomery. Find someone who will listen." She hesitated. Another gunshot whizzed past, forcing her choice. Marcus squeezed her hand once before shoving her toward the river. "Run." Selma ran, her heart breaking with every step. She didn't look back, not even when she heard Marcus fire his gun. One last stand against the order. Selma's body ached as she stumbled into Montgomery at dawn. Every muscle screamed for rest, but she didn't have time. The journal was still clutched in her trembling hands, her grandfather's last words, the truth behind the order. She pushed open the doors of a small law office, the only place she could think of where someone might believe her. The young lawyer behind the desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" Selma's voice was hoarse, but steady. "I need to report a murder and a conspiracy." 30 minutes later, she sat across from a federal investigator, her hands shaking as she handed over the journal. The agent flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with every word. He exhaled sharply. "This is more than a murder. This is a domestic terror group." Selma nodded. "And they won't stop until someone stops them." The agent met her gaze. "Then let's take them down." 2 weeks later, the world knew the order's name. Selma sat in a courtroom as Grayson was led in, his face blank but his eyes burning with hatred. The evidence was undeniable. The journal, Marcus's testimony, everything. The judge's gavel slammed. Guilty. Selma let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. As she stepped outside, the warm Alabama sun bathed her in light. She wasn't just her grandfather's granddaughter anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor, a voice for justice. She pulled out her phone and hit record. To everyone watching, this is what justice looks like. My grandfather's story isn't just his, it's ours. If you believe in truth, in accountability, in fighting for what's right, then do your part. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. This isn't just a story. It's a movement. The fight wasn't over. But Selma would never stop fighting.